Let's talk a little bit more about the movie Selma and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We talked earlier about the Selma timeline. There's about a 2-year period that the film is kind of referencing. There's some things that happened before and obviously things that happened after, but this is the basic structure. And the focus of the film is on the month of March in 1965, with some flashbacks to other things that had happened earlier. One of the things to note about the film, and one of the things that makes it successful, is here in the words of critic David Edelstein, the film dramatizes that King wasn't just a preacher. He wasn't just a person who made inspiring speeches, but he was actually a very important, significant political actor. He knew what he was doing. He worked with other people who knew what they were doing, and they would strategize, discuss tactics, and their successes were not just a result of, like I say, inspiring speeches, but because they took concrete steps to make their goals achievable. In a paraphrase, remember, no direct quotes from King are used in the film, but in a paraphrase, Ava DuVernay and screenwriter Paul Webb have King say, "As long as I'm unable to exercise my constitutional right to vote, I do not have command over my own life. I cannot determine my own destiny, for it is determined for me by," note here, "people who would rather see me suffer than succeed." I think that's an important quote, that it's not that the white community in Alabama was, indifferent to what was happening with the African American community. They were actively hostile and taking steps to undermine the success, the economic success, but political power of members of the African American community. So what does that mean? That means protest, that means march, that means disturb the peace, that means jail, that means risk, and that is hard. Now again, it's a paraphrase, but that's kind of accurate. King is saying this is not just about inspirational speeches and feeling good and kumbaya and singing spirituals. It's about taking a stand. It's about taking a risk. People are getting beat up. People are getting killed. People are afraid. They're getting their houses and their businesses burned. And all of that was very, very hard. You all might be familiar with the famous letter from a Birmingham jail. Many schools read it. It's kind of an inspirational story. Despite, adverse circumstances, King writes this very famous letter. And part of the theme of that letter is later expanded into this book, Why We Can't Wait. We can't wait any longer. We've waited long enough. So those who are telling us to just be patient don't know what they're really asking. We've been patient for so long, for too long. It's time for patience to end, and it's time for things to get accomplished. Another thing I think that's worth looking at is, what did the Southern Christian Leadership Conference really ask of people? And this commitment card is an interesting exemplar of that. They would engage in real training. Just like you would train people in self-defense techniques, they would train people in passive or, active, really, non-violence techniques. Part of this commitment, and it's interesting, there are 10 commitments like there are 10 commandments. Part of it is overtly religious. I would say the portions I've highlighted here in green feel pretty religious. And then part of it is a little more secular, a little more concrete. So meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus, obviously a very spiritual point. But then, borrowing from Gandhi and others, remember that the nonviolent movement seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. And there's a long, long conversation that has to be had with folks to get them to understand the difference between justice and reconciliation and something that might be called just victory. Walk and talk in love because God is love. Pray daily to be used by God. Again, very spiritual. But goal is that all men might be free, all men. So there's this sense that even the white folks who think they're free, they're really not, because they're kind of laboring under their own oppression, self-caused, self-generated oppression. Sacrifice your personal wishes. That's another kind of, I think, spiritual value. And then, spiritual value, but also practical. Observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. A simple point to make, but really a powerful one in this context, right? We're fighting for our lives, for our liberty, our freedom, but observe the rules of courtesy. Seek to perform regular service for others in the world, spiritual, perhaps also practical. Refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, or heart. Again, Martin Luther King has a deep, deep commitment to nonviolence. There are seminars worth of education and theory building involved in Martin Luther King's understanding of nonviolence. And he's trying to capture some of it here in these very short little commandments or commitments. Nonviolence isn't just nonviolence of the fist, but the tongue. No harsh words, and try to have a nonviolent heart so that it's really motivated from within. Strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health. Keep yourself well-centered and also healthy. And then, interestingly and important, follow the directions of the movement and of the captain of a demonstration. Like soldiers who are in a battle, the soldiers in this non-violent battle have to be able to follow instructions, follow directions, even perhaps sometimes if you don't understand. So remember in that scene where in the second march, the police open their lines and it looks as if they're inviting the marchers to walk through. That took King off guard. He wasn't sure what was happening there. He was afraid they might be walking into a trap. Not knowing what this was all about, he decided to back down. Not everybody understood why he was doing that. Not everybody agreed with him doing that. But part of his strategy was make sure we all stay on message and on task. And so follow the captain of a demonstration. It's one of the ways that we're going to preserve our commitment to nonviolence and to being strategic and smart. The film gets a lot right. One of the things it gets right is there was clearly tension between President Johnson and Martin Luther King over the timetable, over the sequence of events. Originally, Martin Luther King and many of the others in the leadership wanted the 1964 Civil Rights Act to be the whole kind of enchilada, you might say. Have voting rights and everything kind of wrapped up in one giant piece of legislation in 1964. Johnson and his political strategists thought that that really wasn't going to work. And so they broke it up into what they saw as three components. The Civil Rights Act in 64. In 65, they were planning to bring forward the war on poverty, so a bunch of economic issues. And then in 66, they would bring forward the Voting Rights Act. And that was a source of big disagreement between Johnson and King. Johnson thought the Civil Rights Act in 64 was a great achievement, but that voting rights should wait till 65. Martin Luther King thought that was just too long, that we have been waiting too long and we don't want to wait longer. This should be something that should be accomplished not in 66, but it should be accomplished in 1965. So there are some disagreements there. Another thing the film gets right is LBJ and his arguments with Governor Wallace. Wallace of Alabama was actually a Democrat. Johnson is a Democrat. They ended up running against each other in 1964. So they obviously were not in agreement on a lot of things. Wallace was quite the unreconstructed segregationist and racist. And Johnson and Wallace did literally meet and have arguments pretty much of the nature as portrayed in the film. That's not something that they made up in any sense. Another thing they got right is the strategy sessions for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Again, they weren't just about giving speeches, they were about strategy. So they had big arguments. People who agreed on the goal but saw different ways of getting there. And so the film gives you a little bit of a peek into how that played out. Obviously, the film is very poignant in its portrayal of violence against the civil rights movement, and that was very, very accurate. It was a terribly violent period. It also does a good job of showing the personal toll on King himself, the death threats, but no more than that, just the loss of a sense of control over his personal life. He couldn't be there for his children's sporting events or birthdays sometimes. He'd have to be out on the road. People were demanding things of him, expecting things of him. And then, there was this issue of him having affairs, that he was kind of a rock star personality. He was charming and attractive and interesting and lonely out on the road, and wasn't always the most faithful spouse. We came to know that over time. There were some people who knew it at the time, but most people didn't. And so there's always been, some question as to, how much did this role he took on, how much did that, undermine his personal life and his relationship with his wife? Would he have been a better husband if he could have just been, what he aspired to be? He said he just wanted to be a small town minister and maybe teach as a professor at a college and just live that kind of peaceful life. That was the temptation. But he kept being called to higher service. Well, the film does take some creative license. We'll talk a little bit more about. It makes LBJ into more of an antagonist, more opposed to King than he really was. It really takes some license in the extent to which it shows LBJ working with J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI on blackmailing King. It really isn't at all clear historically that that is quite what happened. We saw the timeline is kind of compressed, but it's also reordered. And in particular, the FBI blackmail letter that comes, that wasn't anywhere near March of 1965. It had nothing to do with the Selma marches. It wasn't the reason why King didn't show up for one of the marches. Specifically, if you go back to the timeline, the FBI blackmail letter, which is sometimes referred to as a suicide letter because it seemed to imply that King ought to commit suicide or else all this negative stuff about him would come out. That actually was released by the FBI or secretly, sent to King in November of 1964. So that's months and months earlier than the Selma marches that are portrayed in the film. And so it really didn't have that impact. It wasn't part of that sequence of events in March of 1965. Now, it's in the background, obviously. It's part of the lives of the people who were involved. But just like the church bombing in September of 1963 was part of the background that led to the Selma marches, it didn't happen in the time sequence that close to the Selma marches. And then just, by reference, the letter from Birmingham jail is all the way back in April of 1963, prior even to the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech. Now, how much does this matter? Do historical films really have an obligation to be historically accurate? And this is debated, all the time with regard to historical films. It's not something that's just related to Selma or any other particular film, any of the films that we've been looking at. It's a constant ongoing debate. One example that I think is kind of interesting is in the movie Titanic from 1997, there's this very dramatic scene where the first officer shoots some passengers who are trying to, riot and take over some lifeboats. And then kind of in a moment of, anguish, he shoots himself. Very dramatic scene in the film, but the first officer was a real person, a guy named William McMaster Murdoch, and was actually a highly decorated sailor and was considered sort of a hero by a lot of folks for the actions he took on the ship. His family has created kind of a great honor around his legacy, and there's even a scholarship that's handed out in his name every year. So this film portrayed him in a way that really offended a lot of people from his community, obviously from his family. Paramount Studios itself contributed about $10,000 worth of money. It was £5,000 back in 1998, but worth about $10,000 today, as a kind of apology for kind of portraying this guy in a way that probably wasn't fair to him. So when you do these historical films, you have to keep in mind that sometimes you're impugning the character of a real person. Well, so what do we make of that? Interesting article in Scientific American. What does Hollywood teach us, and how can historically inaccurate films sometimes be a valuable teaching tool? Just by way of thinking about sourcing, Scientific American, it's not a general interest newspaper, but it is, or news magazine, but it is not also, kind of primary academic research. What's interesting is that Scientific American tries to present to a general audience some things that it derives from academic research. So, for example, this article itself in Scientific American comes from primary scholarly research from a journal called Psychological Science, which is a peer-reviewed journal. So we have a bunch of genuine academics who make a study of how using popular films in classroom education can work and can misfire. And kind of revealing my hand a little bit, I think what you'll see here is, I'm trying to take some of the guidance from this research and use it in the class that we've been having this semester. So for example, they write, educators believe that the vividness of film can be a valuable teaching tool, and I agree with that. That's why I'm supporting and using this syllabus and this idea. But what about it? What about the situation where the facts are wrong? Do such films do more harm than good? What the researchers found was watching films did help students learn. It was more vivid, it came more alive, and that was sort of useful. But, they note, when the information in the film and maybe other historically accurate readings were contradictory, that is, when the film was inaccurate, the students were more likely to recall the film's distorted version. And what's worse, in some sense, they were very confident in their memories, even though they were wrong. So we want to try to avoid that. How do we avoid that? Well, the research suggests we can use film, even historically inaccurate films, and we can learn from them. But there's a way we do that. A good teacher, they say, can trump a movie's shortcomings. When the teachers gave very detailed warnings about the inaccuracies in the film version, the students got it. But those warnings had to be extremely precise. And I think, what I've been trying to do in the course of this semester is, when we're looking at a historical film like, say, North Country, I'm trying to be very precise about what the film got right and what the film got wrong. And hopefully, if these researchers are correct, it's helping you use the vividness of the film to learn information, but use the warnings to not be confused by the historical inaccuracies. So let's review some of the facts related to this film. The portrayal of John Lewis in this film is actually quite good. Lewis is maybe even a more interesting character than he seems to be in the film. He's born in about 1940, so the events of this film, he's about 25. But he's been a very active young man. He met and was inspired by Rosa Parks at 17, and then Martin Luther King at 18. He became part of organizing the Freedom Riders at 21. The Freedom Riders were young people who tried to take up the promise of the Constitution that says people have the right to travel in interstate commerce and not be molested by state police powers. Well, they wanted to take that seriously and put that to the test. So they tried to ride buses from place to place in the South, and met with tremendous amount of violence. Um, John Lewis thought he was going to be killed a couple of times, but these people were relentless, but using the tactics of nonviolence that they learned from King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So by age 23, he's been arrested 24 times, all of it for good reason. His autobiography, I think, was called Good Trouble. Get yourself in good trouble was one of his favorite expressions. He became the chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and the tensions between SNCC and SCLC are portrayed in the film. But Lewis and others said, well, it wasn't as tense as perhaps as portrayed. There were differences in some approaches and some strategy, but King was actually very supportive of SNCC. And even when SNCC wanted to do something different from what the Southern Christian Leadership Conference wanted to do, sometimes maybe that is the right thing to do. Let the kids be a little more risky. That's okay. And then, very profoundly, by age 23, he's speaking at the March on Washington. Gave one of the speeches just before Martin Luther King's speech. Now, his speech, he wrote it, and members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee edited it, and they had some really strong language in there, especially strong language against President Kennedy, asking more of the president. King and his folks asked Lewis to tone that down a little bit, and he did at their request. So again, there's this tension, but both King and John Lewis speak of it as a productive tension, not really at odds with one another. Also in the film, they portray the events around the killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson. If you recall in the film, he is the one who's shot in the cafe up against the um, jukebox. So who's Jimmy Lee Jackson? His father dies when he's 18, just about your age. He ends up taking over the family farm and becoming responsible for his whole family. Um, and even though he's kind of an uneducated farmer, he's very motivated politically, smart guy, and has some aspirations. He tries to register to vote for 4 years, along with his mother, Viola, and his grandfather, Cager Lee, both of whom are portrayed in the film. Becomes an activist after being inspired by Martin Luther King. Becomes a deacon in his church at the age of 25 in 1964. Then in February 1965, he decides to do some work, on the streets. So one of the organizers from King's organization, James Orange, was in Selma trying to get teenagers to distribute voting information, black teenagers, and he was arrested with the kind of absurd charge of contributing to the delinquency of minors by trying to get them involved in the distribution of voting information. So he's in jail, and the local church in Selma decides to have a protest against the jailing of James Orange. And Jimmy Lee Jackson, deacon of the church, and some of his family members, his mother and his grandfather, they decide to participate in that march. The Selma police violently attack the marchers, and there's a scene in the film where Jimmy Lee and his mother and his grandfather, they duck into a cafe, they pretend to be eating at the cafe, but the police enter, recognize who they are, and start beating them and hassling them. And in particular, they had tossed Jimmy Lee's mother to the ground, and at that point, Jimmy Lee, of course, tries to protect his mother, and that's when he gets shoved up against the jukebox and shot at very close range, powder burns on his stomach. The police officer's gun was essentially up against his stomach. He was then further beaten by the police after having been shot, and then died in the hospital 8 days later. And as they kind of suggest in the film, it was the killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson that led to the first Selma voting rights march. The film itself portrays this killing with really precise accuracy, almost beat by beat. Every element of the portrayal of the killing is historically accurate, with one odd exception, which is, in reality, it was worse than what they portray, because after the police shoot Jimmy Lee, the police officers leave, and his mother, holds him and cries. They sort of give the impression that he dies right away, but he didn't. He actually started to crawl away after having been shot, and then the police officers beat him further. So it's kind of even more horrible somehow. Um, then, as in the film, Martin Luther King actually spoke at Jimmy Lee Jackson's funeral. Um, in his actual speech, he says, Jimmy Lee Jackson's death says to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly to make the American dream a reality. His death must prove that unmerited suffering does not go unredeemed. We must not be bitter, and we must not harbor ideas of retaliating with violence. We must not lose faith in our white brothers. Tough thing to say after what's just happened. Um, in the film, they note Jimmy Lee had promised to his grandfather, he said, Pops, you're going to vote before you're done. And very poignantly, that turned out to be true. After the Voting Rights Act is passed, that later in that year, November, the election cycle comes around, and Cager Lee voted for the first time in his life at age 84. So Jimmy Lee Jackson's prophecy had come true. His grandfather voted before he died. Now, the killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson was a serious wrong. People understood that even at the time. A grand jury was convened to try and review the actions of the police officer, but they refused to indict in September of 1965. Interestingly, in 2007, of course, years later, a different county district attorney charged the police officer, who was actually an Alabama state trooper, with first-degree murder. The officer admitted to the essential facts of what happened, pled guilty to manslaughter, and the district attorney and the judge accepted that plea. The officer was sentenced to 6 months, but was released after about 5 months for ill health. You can imagine he's quite elderly at this time, so a lot of time has passed. People were quite angry. On one level, yeah, it's nice that there's finally a prosecution, but manslaughter and 5 months in jail doesn't seem to quite address, what had happened to Jimmy Lee Jackson. But the film gets that story quite right. Another story that it gets right, kind of a somewhat smaller story in the whole scheme of things, but still important, is the story of Annie Lee Cooper, a character portrayed by Oprah Winfrey in the film. Annie Lee Cooper had been born in Selma, but had moved north as an adult, worked in various nursing homes and other facilities, sometimes as a maid or nanny in people's houses. Lived in Pennsylvania and Ohio for many, many years, and registered and voted there because it wasn't so hard in these certain parts of the North. She eventually moved back to Selma to take care of her own elderly parents, and then tried to register when she got back to Selma, but was denied. So they kind of portray that scene, the Oprah Winfrey character is trying to register to vote. They didn't kind of go into the background of why she thought she should be able to register to vote, having been a registered voter in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Then during one of the demonstrations, as portrayed in the film, she ends up punching Sheriff Jim Clark, and then got beat and arrested by the local police because of it. She ends up dying in just 2010, which you guys were 7 years old when she died, which is just kind of a reminder that this is not ancient history. This is still something that's part of our lives. John Lewis tells the story of Annie Lee Cooper saying, Sheriff Clark whacked her so hard we could hear the sound several rows back. And that's kind of portrayed in the film. Martin Luther King, in an actual speech later that night, says, this is what happened today. Mrs. Cooper was down in that line, and the police haven't told the press the truth about it. Mrs. Cooper wouldn't have turned around and hit Sheriff Clark just to be hitting. And of course, as you know, we teach a philosophy of not retaliating and not hitting back. So, he's not completely on the side of Mrs. Cooper. But the truth of the situation is that Mrs. Cooper, if she did anything, was provoked by Sheriff Clark. He hit her first with his stick. And at that moment, he was engaging in some very ugly business as usual action. And this is what brought about the scene there. So they portray even this smaller story of Annie Lee Cooper with great accuracy in the film. They show some scenes of the Martin Luther King character and the LBJ character talking in the White House. I've heard some people wonder, well, is that real? Is that something that really happened? And, you know, the picture here on the left kind of portrays, yeah, that really happened. Martin Luther King and LBJ really did meet and speak in the White House about strategy and tactics, about legislative opportunities. So it's definitely part of the story. Presidential historian Mark Updegrove says the film bothered him a little bit because of the way it portrayed LBJ as being more hostile than he really was. There was some differences of opinion about tactics and timetable, but Johnson was not really hostile to what King was trying to accomplish. He says, in truth, the partnership between LBJ and MLK on civil rights is one of the most productive and consequential in American history. He tells an interesting story. According to Andrew Young, who was one of King's staff members, right after Dr. King won the Nobel Prize, President Johnson talked for about an hour about why he didn't have the power to introduce voting rights legislation in 1965, and he gave very good reasons. He kept saying, I just don't have the power. I wish I did. When we left, I asked Dr. King, well, what do you think? And he said, I think we've got to figure out a way to get this president some power. That's a great quote. And it's part of, what you see King doing, even in the film, that he doesn't have to be hostile to what Johnson is doing, but he's going to strategize a way to get his agenda to become Johnson's agenda. And he eventually definitely does. Another character in the film, not given too much time, is Judge Frank Johnson, who's portrayed by Martin Sheen. Judge Johnson was appointed district court judge for the Middle District of Alabama in 1955 by Republican President Dwight Eisenhower, and served in that position until 1979. And then in 79, Democratic President Jimmy Carter appointed him to the U.S. Court of Appeals, so kind of a promotion. And he stayed there until really 1999. Now you think about that scope of time, 55 to 99, that's 44 years. But 55 to 99 is an unbelievable sweep of time in terms of the amount of change that you would see in the law of civil rights in the United States. In kind of a weird, historical quirk, Frank Johnson and George Wallace were classmates in law school. They knew each other as young men in their early 20s. Johnson was always a Republican. Wallace was always a Democrat. Johnson was always opposed to racism. Wallace was always a racist, but got more racist and got worse as he became, as he took higher and higher political office. Wallace was actually a state court judge in Alabama before becoming governor. So they both were also on the bench at the same time, but Johnson at a higher level as a federal court judge. Johnson didn't just handle this one case. And one of the things that I think is interesting, and not something that the film necessarily would have had to go into, is kind of who Johnson was and what was on his docket as a judge over the years. So remember, he takes the bench in 1955. One of his early cases is actually the Rosa Parks case itself. It goes under the name of Browder versus Gale. Rosa Parks was just one of several women who were arrested for, not riding the bus, not riding in the back of the bus. She wasn't alone in that. And then he ends up ordering the integration of public transportation in the city of Montgomery. In another case in 1961, he invalidates a plan in Tuskegee, Alabama to take away the voting strength of African Americans. Then in 1961, he orders the state to allow people to register to vote, although they still find ways to obstruct that. As I mentioned, he actually I mentioned John Lewis and the Freedom Riders case, 1961. John Lewis is actually a litigant in a lawsuit in front of Judge Johnson, same judge, arguing that Greyhound bus and other facilities associated with interstate busing were still continuing to discriminate. And Judge Johnson gave an order that required desegregation and upheld the goal of the Freedom Riders. Then in 1965, we have this case, Williams versus Wallace. This is actually Hosea Williams, who's one of Martin Luther King's staff guys, a minister who's portrayed in the film Selma, suing George Wallace, demanding that the march from Selma to Alabama be allowed to take place, with the kind of conversations and debates that were portrayed in the film. He continues to have complicated cases, a case in '66 where the state is not allowing blacks to serve on juries. The Alabama poll tax was being used. That's mentioned in the film Selma, that you have to pay this fee in order to register to vote, and you have to pay a fee for every year that you could have registered to vote but did not. So it actually adds up to a lot of money. This was a Voting Rights Act case. The Voting Rights Act had struck down the Alabama poll tax, and Johnson enforced it in this case. Ordered the desegregation of the YMCA in Montgomery in 1970, and then mandated that the state of Alabama start hiring police officers, both at the state and local level, in a case in 1974. So, 1974 is starting to feel like pretty late, but we're still having these kind of fights. Johnson was featured in a book written by political scientist Jack Peltison called 58 Lonely Men. The 58 lonely men he's talking about are the federal judges, circuit judges and appellate judges in the South, and how they had to kind of stand up to local community pressure in order to achieve school desegregation and other advances in civil rights. Johnson regularly received death threats and was often ostracized socially. Remember, he's living in Montgomery, Alabama, not somewhere in Washington, D.C., where he would be, safe. A cross was burned in his lawn in 1956 because of his decision in the Rosa Parks case. His mother's house was bombed in 1967. Fortunately, she was not injured. And for 20 years, from the mid-50s into the mid-70s, he had to have special bodyguards from the U.S. Marshals Service because of this constant death threats. So it took a lot for somebody, even as someone as powerful as a federal judge, to stand up to the terrorism of the white supremacist groups that were dominant in the South for so long. When Judge Johnson retired, John Lewis was one of many, many people who wrote statements in support of Judge Johnson and statements of thanks for what he had achieved over the years. So, kind of an interesting closure of the circle that begins in '61 when John Lewis is a young freedom rider and Frank Johnson is the judge presiding over that case. John Lewis continued to respect Johnson for what he'd accomplished after all those years. And after all that struggle and all that frustration, Johnson eventually becomes respected for what he had achieved. So, for example, the federal courthouse in Montgomery, Alabama is renamed in his honor when he steps down from full-time service in 1991. The building is now, since 1992, named the Frank Johnson Federal Courthouse Building and Courthouse. He stays on a part-time basis till 1999, but on the occasion of his stepping down from full-time service, they renamed the courthouse in his honor. So you see a lot of this in the South, where folks finally start to win some respect for the role that they played. Significantly, the National Voting Rights Museum, which also has a research institute, is in Selma, Alabama itself. Notice the logo. What is that logo? That's the bridge. So the National Voting Rights Museum takes as its very logo the Edmund Pettus Bridge and what happened on that bridge. Here's some scenes from exhibits inside the museum, the visitor center of the museum. If you get a chance to be down in Selma, Alabama, take a look. Um, History was made here. The film Selma isn't just taking, some odd, quirky little chapter in American history and, blowing it up to represent something bigger. Um, this was something big. It was recognized at the time and continues to be recognized today. This is what it took to get voting rights accomplished, to get voting rights to become meaningful. And so all those people who suffered, some killed, some beaten, disregarded and humiliated, today, finally, there's some respect for who they are and what they accomplished.